Hello, this is Writers at Work, a podcast for readers and writers about the joys, heartaches, challenges, and satisfaction of the creative writing process. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. My guest on this episode of Writers at Work is Lisa Unger, the best-selling author whose latest novel is Close Your Eyes and Count to 10. The tale involves a high concept. Her protagonist, the physically fit Adele Crane, participates in a reality competition program called Extreme Hide and Seek that's held on a remote island. The show's founder and star, the deliciously named Maverick Dylan, is aging and increasingly unhinged. The last time around, one contestant was lost and never found. So what will happen now? I won't tell. Close Your Eyes and Count to 10 is Lisa's 23rd book. She's moved back and forth between series and standalones. Her most recent series was House of Crows, a 4-part serial released in 2021. Prior to the new one, her most recent novel was The New Couple in 5B, now available in paperback, in which an apartment in a sinister New York building is the setting for a psychological thriller that recalls Rosemary's Baby and The Shining set 1,700 miles to the east. I should mention here that while Lisa has worked with our producer, Erin Mitchell, she and I have never actually spoken, though we belong to the same mystery, crime, and thriller communities for more than a decade. So this will be a treat for me, and I hope for you too. Lisa Unger, welcome to Writers at Work.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Great. Lisa, in the introduction, I used the term high concept. Is it fair to say that you begin with what you think is a concept that will hook readers?
Actually, no, it's not. I tend to really start with character voice. Like that is really the thing for me that where everything begins and ends. And it might be, the inspiration for a book might be an actual experience. It might be, it could be a news story. In one case, it was a piece of junk mail. It might be a line of poetry. And it leads me usually to like a swath of research about something that I'm obsessed with. And so I tend to spend a lot of time researching something that I'm not necessarily sure is going to be part of anything, but it's just something that is like what's occupying my curiosity. And then I feel like if it connects with something that's bigger that's going on within me, then I start to hear a voice or voices. And those are the voices that I follow through the narrative. I wouldn't say that I come to the narrative with a concept or an idea. I certainly don't know how the book is going to end or even really what it's about when I start writing. So it's, the concept might evolve in the writing, but it's not the impetus for the story.
I see. So you have your characters. How do they emerge from setting? Um, they exist before you decide on your setting?
They do. They exist before the setting, generally speaking. I usually have like a very strong voice in my head. It might be like just kind of, an energy. There might be a place, there might, a lot of times it's New York City or, the Northeast, which is where I'm from. And sometimes not, sometimes, once I just saw a character and she was running through the desert in, this in the Santa Fe area. And one time there was a woman blackout, she was on a boat and they could be anywhere doing anything. They are always almost always in action when I first started, first start hearing that voice. There might be more than one person. Sometimes it's like a very urgent, first person present tense. Sometimes it might be more, oblique. It might be, omniscient, multiple voices, but the voices are always where it starts. And the setting emerges in the telling of the story. Like in the same way that if you met somebody and you got to know them and over time they told you where they were from and what's going on in their life, that's kind of how it works for me.
Right. Do you feel you have to
Yeah.
identify with a character in order to make them more vivid?
Have to empathize. I have to empathize with the character. I don't necessarily need to identify with the character. My characters are a lot of them are pretty troubled, mentally ill, addicted, etc. I generally none of those things. So I have to empathize. I have to understand where my character is coming from and what is driving them, and feel some deep empathy for them. Otherwise, I don't know that I could bring them alive in the same way for
Right. No,
my reader.
empathize is a much better word than identify. Um, I read somewhere that your personal life isn't anything like the dark, twisted worlds you like to explore. Um, I think you've just made it clear that that's correct, that you're not uh, like that. But what is the appeal of the dark side for you as a writer?
Well, I feel like I've always had this really kind of dark curiosity, even as a kid. And, it's not 100% true that there's been nothing dark in my life. When I was a kid and we were living in this town in New Jersey, a friend of mine, a girl that I played with on the school orchestra, was abducted and murdered. And even before that, I had a lot of questions about things that I didn't understand, like sort of dark appetites in film and literature and all of that. Like it just had been like a curiosity I had. And then when this happened in our life in our town, it was a deeply traumatic event for everybody who was connected to it. For the kids in the town who not this is like the kind of place where you move your family to be safe from the city, right? It's like a suburb of New York City. And it was like the kind of place where I know my parents felt we were always going to be safe. Like that's
Mm.
why you lived there. And the girl I knew, she had just happened to miss the bus. And she missed the bus before, and her mom was annoyed about it. And she said, "You know what? Walk home." And it was, she should have been able to walk home. Should have been perfectly fine and perfectly safe. It just so happened it wasn't on that particular day. And so after that, I had a lot more questions about the dark side of life. I felt that life was one thing and the world was one thing before that day and another thing after that day. And as a young girl, I had questions. What makes somebody kill somebody? Why her? Why not me? Why, how could somebody who is so like me, so innocent, how could she be asked to suffer in this way? And, I had all these questions and I asked them of the adults in my life, and nobody, of course, had any answers, which to me as a child seemed like they just weren't telling me the truth. They weren't giving me the answers. And so I started to sort of look for those answers in books and in my own writing. And then sort of like at a really inappropriately young age, I read In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. And I was already in love with Truman Capote as a writer from, like things like Music for Chameleons and Other Voices, Other Rooms. And that book gave me like a permission, I think, in some ways to be the writer that I wanted to be, which was somebody who wanted to walk on the dark side, wanted to explore, wanted to understand what was there, and wanted to do it with empathy.
Is
And so that's sort of I mean, maybe that's the long answer or the short
No, no,
answer.
no, no. That is interesting. I mean, these seminal events in our lives,
Yeah.
uh, they echo and they reemerge. And was is writing cathartic for you in a sense? Does it help you work out the sort of confrontation with that type of terrible thing that happened?
Yeah, it does. It is cathartic. For me, writing is an escape hatch. Like I have always been a writer. I do not remember a time in my life where I didn't write, even as a kid. And I was before that, of course, I was a reader. All writers are readers first, right?
Right.
So my mom was a librarian, so books. My dad, who recently passed, he was an engineer, and he was a great reader of nonfiction, right? So I had this like, kind of reading, you know, um, just like a wide range of material available to me always. And then once I started writing, that was where I always have been the most comfortable, like in on the page, in the written word, that is where I sort of do all my best thinking. That is where I explore things that bother me, that I question about people. It's an escape hatch in that I can always go there, no matter what horrible thing is going on in my life or what I'm dealing with in my life or the world or whatever. I know that a lot of times people feel like their lives distract them from the page or keep them from the page. For me, that's where I go to manage, to metabolize darkness. That's sort of always been my process.
I love that phrase, metabolize darkness. Are you a plotter or a pantser? For our listeners, let me explain. A plotter tends to outline the story, while a pantser is someone who makes it up as they go along. Which are you, Lisa?
I I would like to, I want to change the phrase. I want to call it a gardener because that's more like what it is for me than a pantser, which is probably closer to the truth. But like a gardener where a seed gets planted and you kind of give it light and water and air and it kind of starts to grow. Maybe you prune something or it starts to flower over here, and as you're going, it's a kind of the story grows from a seed, as opposed to a pantser, which kind of always sounds to me like, oh wow, I accidentally wrote a book, which of course is not the truth of it, regardless of whether you're outlining or pantsing, as it were. So I that's kind of more a better analogy for me because I always feel like I don't feel like, which this kind of interesting is that like I don't think the process is all that different, the gardener versus the outliner. It's
Right.
just that it takes me like a year to outline the book
Okay.
with all the details, and then
Yeah.
maybe if you're an outliner, you create a scaffolding and
Right.
things change within within the writing of the book. So I don't really, yeah, I think that's really more like what it is for me. It's more like it's like more like a gardening than a
Yeah.
pantsing.
Yeah. I don't know if it's either or. I mean, I think the thing about pantsing, though, which I find really amusing, is that you can find yourself in a quandary and then just go back and change something four chapters earlier, and then you're all right again. And
Yeah.
if you go to a museum and you see manuscripts from Dickens, or they're completely covered in arrows and correction marks, and because they were pantsing at a certain point, and they realize, wait a second, I've really gone off track here, and the only way to get back is to change something that happened earlier. Um, yeah, I mean, I in reading the new book, um, I felt the narrative pull through. I didn't feel at any point where you had kind of lost direction.
Yeah, no, I mean, it really does. I mean, I think in a lot of ways, like my brain just like a lot of times I feel like my subconscious knows the story better than my conscious mind does. Like like I'll be writing something and I'll go, why did I just write that? Like, why is that there? And I just know myself well enough to know to just leave it, right? Because then 50 pages later, I'm like, oh, right.
Right, right, right.
That's
No,
why, you
the,
know,
the,
I think that's kind of just I think that's just kind of the way, it's just the way my brain works. The story evolves for me on the page. And I generally don't find myself in a corner or in a quandary. Like this has come up in a bunch of different talks of course, like do you find yourself in a corner? Do you have to go back? Of course, there's always an editorial process. Of course, as a story develops, there's always things that you're going to go back and change, right? Like that is the nature of when you write this way, that's the nature of how we write. But it does really evolve for me on the page, the way it will evolve for the reader. And it's kind of like this, it's also, there's like a lot of patience within the process as well. Like, okay, I'm writing and then I'm not. And I'm like, okay, well, okay, I just am gonna go do the laundry or bake a cake or, make a chili or something, like anything other than writing, and just kind of create a blank space for the next thing to come. Right? Like I'm never superimposing the story onto the process. right? There's no like, oh, I have this story I want to write. And okay, well, I had this like artificial word count, so I'm going to write whatever to get to that word count, and then I'll go back and fix it later. Like I don't do anything like that. When it stops, when
Right.
the flow stops, I stop. And then,
Boy, I couldn't agree. I couldn't agree more.
yeah,
The subconscious mind is such a great ally,
yes, it is.
and you can't turn it on and off.
Right. You have to respect the subconscious. You have to respect the gestation period within the creative process. You have to respect the ebb and the flow of the creative process.
Yeah, I think many aspiring writers don't realize that
Yes.
we're writing all the time.
Yes,
You know,
all the time.
it's not just when we're at the keyboard or with a pen in our hand.
Of
Our mind is always shaping stories.
Yes. And that's why you have to protect your blank spaces and protect your boredom. Like that's something that I talk about a lot when I talk about creativity is that you need to respect those empty spaces because that's where everything lives. Like when you're just, staring at the clouds or, waiting at the doctor's office or anywhere, right? Doing anything in your life, don't fill every second of your life with that device.
Right.
Let it take all your brain power and don't turn your brain over to that like sort of dopamine fixation that we all have now, right? We're always looking for something on that phone, like there's something there. There's nothing there, trust me. It's all within. Everything that you need is already within you, and you just have to wait for it to find its way onto the page.
Yeah. We have many friends who do the word count,
Mm,
and they'll write 2,000 words a day or something, and some of these people are hugely successful,
sure.
and I think to myself, therefore you must be pushing yourself past the point where you're at your best, or you're
Mm,
stopping before the point where you're at your best.
yeah.
Right? I mean, don't. I mean, I think what you just said is you write as long as you're being productive.
That's right. I write and I'm an early morning writer. It's almost always the first thing I do. I try to get started before everybody else gets up. That's kind of my goal every day, is to have a blank space, a quiet space that nobody wants. When my daughter was little, that space used to be like from 4 a.m. to 6 a.m.
Right.
She got older, she's off to college, my day expands, but I'm still an early morning writer. But I write, with intention. I don't have and I understand that people have word counts and they need that, and that maybe keeps them disciplined and keeps them set. For me, it's more of a time block, as opposed to a word count. I mean, I'm always writing. I'm a natural writer. It's harder for me not to write. So I don't have to worry about word count. Like I don't have to say, oh my gosh, I have to get this much done today, or I'm not going to get enough done this year. Like that's never going to be a problem for me.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I don't have to do that. And I would rather be able to honor my subconscious process and honor like, that voice that kicks in when you're on the treadmill or when you're
Right.
taking a walk on the beach or when you're throwing the ball for your dog, when all of a sudden that next thing is like, oh, it's there. And then
Right.
you're back up doing the work.
Do you think people who believe in the muse are actually talking about their subconscious mind?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I again in creativity, I talk about, like the act of writing. It's a little bit of discipline and it's a little bit of magic, right? There is a little bit of magic to it, and maybe that magic also is the subconscious. But I always say to my aspiring writers that, you just need to create the schedule, right? You need to create the schedule that works for you. For me, it's early morning. Maybe for you, it's midnight to 2 a.m. Like wherever you find your quiet space, or maybe it's in the middle of the day when your toddler is sleeping or whatever it winds up being. But you create the space and then you discipline your mind to be available for creativity during that scheduled space. And then you will be amazed at how often the muse will meet you there.
Ah,
It's a combination of discipline and being available to the magic. And you can't do one without the other. Like you can't be without that discipline because it is a craft and it is something that you hone and you get better at and you work at and you study and you every time you sit down to the page, hopefully you're bringing a better writer to the page than you did yesterday. I mean, that's my goal for sure, that I'm better every day. But it's so you need that discipline because it is a real thing that you're doing. It's not some fantasy. It is an actual art and craft and, an effort. But there is a magical piece to it as well. So but you have to be there in order to receive the magic.
Yes, and I think, boy, I really like the way you put that. A little sidebar story. I was once talking to Van Morrison, and I said to him, "But I don't understand this direction you're going into." And he said, "Well, I'm just a vessel. I don't
Mm-hmm.
really have much to do with it. It just pours through me." And I said, "Well, I suppose that could be true of anyone." And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Well, then why are you so good and the rest of us are not?" And I think that goes to what you just said. You have to be prepared for it.
Yeah,
You can't just say, "I'm not going to do anything until the subconscious mind tells me what to do."
right.
You work very hard, you
Yeah.
constantly improve, and then your subconscious mind is more cooperative, I think.
Yeah, or open to receive whatever it is. Like that's the thing. Like, I mean, I understand that concept of feeling like you're channeling something. I mean, like a lot of times I'll go back and read what I wrote and I won't remember having written it. And I don't know what that means. I don't know if that means that you're receiving it or I'm just more present for my subconscious mind, or I just let my subconscious mind have its playpen and do what it wants, and then later on the editor, the writer self comes back and fixes it and makes sure everybody can understand what you wrote, right? Because it's not just about you and your subconscious and whatever like stuff you put out onto the page. There's a different layer to it as well, of course. But yeah, I do think that those people who are creating and who are prolifically creating are maybe just more available to it. They're more willing to receive and willing to do the work that it requires to get it out there.
Right. So how close to your, well, no, let me phrase it another way. Your first drafts, how close are they to what you want to publish? Or I mean, do you just get the story down, or do you really try to have a polished first draft?
Yeah, I do try to have a pretty solid first draft. I do feel like it's usually about like 75% there when I'm finished with that first draft. And then usually it turns out that that first draft is about, 90,000 words. And then my second draft, it was just this all occurs before it goes to my editor, is probably about 100,000 words. And maybe by the end of the day, it's probably like 105. So there's layering, there's like going back and, and adjusting things and making, fleshing out character or, action or whatever is needed. And so it's about, I mean, I think that, there have been times when I have done bigger editorial overhauls in the editorial phase because like a character emerged in the middle that just
Right.
needed more space, like oh wow, unfortunately the book is really about this character, so we have to go back and work with that, right? Like so, but it's all very, for me it's all very it still has a very high energy vibration. It's still very joyful. It's still very like, oh wow, like after a certain point in your life, if you're in your writing life, if you're working with an editor that you love and you have people who read and you know that everybody's kind of like wants the book to be the best that it can be, then when you hear the feedback that's great, you're like, oh yeah, right. Even though maybe you don't want to go back and do all that work, you still know that it's like the right thing, right? And so
Right.
that's kind of a joyful second creative process. And you also know when, there's comments or changes that you're like, oh, I can't do that because then it's not the book I wrote, right? And so,
Right.
but you can have to maybe at that stage you have to do a little bit of detective work, right? Like with your editor, like, okay, this is not working for you. sometimes the thing is not the thing. It's the thing underneath the thing, right? Like
Right, right,
you didn't do something right within the narrative, and that's why it didn't work. So then you figure out why it didn't work, especially if you trust your editor, which I do. If something doesn't work for her, I'm going to figure out why it didn't work.
right.
So, and that's all part of the process, vision and revision and revision. I mean, that has to be part of the joy of it.
Yeah. When you cut, do you save what you cut?
Sometimes,
Have you reused what you cut?
usually not, no. Usually it's just in an outtakes file.
Right, right, right. So,
It's just like, usually when I go through a draft, when I do my editorial draft and things are getting moved and changed and, some things are being added and some things are being taken away, there's usually like an outtakes file, but then I've probably written twice as much as that in the revision process. So that's why my word count keeps going up.
right, right. No, you write a sparkling piece of dialogue or a very vivid description of setting, and you realize that it just doesn't belong in the story anymore.
Yeah,
Um,
it's just
I,
like but it's endemic to that story, like I haven't found the place where you can recycle it or, regurgitate it or whatever. I mean, it's everything that is written is endemic to the story that it was in. So I haven't found those pieces, reemerging elsewhere. Like I haven't found that
okay.
in my work, although I wish.
No, I know. I know writers whose outtake file is longer than the book they've written.
Yeah, exactly.
They've cut more than they've kept. But um,
And then you
so,
read a bunch too, and your editor's like, "This is long." Or like, I mean, what do you want me to do? I can't, I can't
right.
just cut it. Like that's not how it works. But
Um, there is a legendary story at the Wall Street Journal where a reporter kept getting edited and edited and edited on the same story. This is back in the days of paper and typewriters.
right.
And the reporter finally cut the story into little strips of sentences and handed it to the editor and said, "Here, you put it together." It didn't go over very well, by the way, but uh,
Exactly.
yeah,
Sometimes you just can't after a certain point, like especially like in the magazine world or whatever. Like if you just like sometimes they just want you to write what they want you to write, and you're just
right,
like, why did
right,
you ask me to write this? Because
right,
you obviously wanted me to write something else.
right. So getting back to Close Your Eyes and Count to 10, I understand this is the first time you set a novel outside the U.S. Is that true?
Is that true? Yeah, Aaron, is that true? Aaron probably knows better than I do. Yeah, I guess it is. Yeah, I guess that's true. Yeah.
And
No, that's true. No, that's not true. In Die for You, part was partially set in Prague because I was in Prague when I started writing
okay,
it.
okay.
Yeah.
Did you find it invigorating to explore a new setting?
I did, but it was like it felt very organic because we had been to the Azores, like that was the impetus for the book. Like I mean, it took a little while from that, but my family and I traveled to the Azores and we had an experience while we were in the Azores, which was 100% the direct inspiration for this book.
Yeah.
And that was part of I mean that so it felt very organic and we had just been there and it was just very vivid and alive for me. And the experience there was also very vivid and alive for me when we came home. And I had a ton of footage from that. So it was probably the most direct inspiration for a book. Usually the inspiration is like a tiny bit more nebulous, but in this case we were in the Azores and my husband and daughter and I were about to hike the rim of a volcanic lake on San Miguel. And the islands are like an archipelago in the Atlantic, about 1,500 kilometers from the coast of Europe. And so they're like very dramatic. Like the sky is just going to be like this crystalline blue. And then all of a sudden, a gigantic storm is just going to sweep in from nowhere. And it's just like the most amazing, like sort of fecund and just technicolor, amazing place, like wild hydrangeas blooming. And anyway, so this big storm rolled in and we got rained out of our hike. And then on our way back to our hotel, we came upon this like incredibly, like it's unbelievable abandoned structure. It was like this gigantic black thing that was like kind of rising out of the green. And it was a hotel that was built in the 1980s, I would learn later, that went out of business within about 5 years of being built. And it had been like kind of looted and covered with the graffiti, and nature was kind of taking it back. And it was like covered with signs. It was like na entra and peligro and like in any language, right? Like, no, don't go in here. But of course, I was like, well, they don't mean me, right? It's okay for me to go in. So of course, we had to go in and explore it. It was just so unbelievable. And so I knew the minute I walked in that I was going to be writing about it. So that was kind of, it was all very like alive for me. The experience and the writing of it.
Well, you're sort of proving the point you made earlier that the writer's mind never rests.
No, never.
You're
Never. Not even when
not even when you're confronting a ghost hotel on
That's
your
right.
family vacation.
Especially not then.
Okay. So, is it too soon to ask what's next for you?
Maybe a little bit too soon. I actually can just start now talking about close your eyes and count to 10. Like I now just about a month ago figured out what it's actually about. I'm ready to actually talk about it. So I'm not quite ready to talk about what's next, but I will say that, it's a psychological thriller and it's very dark and bad things happen. So it's safe to say all of those things.
All right. My guest has been Lisa Unger, best-selling author of Close Your Eyes and Count to 10. Lisa, thank you so much for joining us on Writers at Work.
Thank you so much for having me.
Writers at Work is a production of Bliss Publications. Erin Mitchell is our producer. Music is by Joni Mitchell, performed by Keith Jarrett. For more, see writersatworkpodcast.com. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. Until next time, happy reading.